post-independence. It's an opportunity to ask questions and hopefully get some answers. The Yes campaign is an all-party and non-party political campaign. My intention in holding this event is not to close down the discussion, but to broaden it out and open up the debate. And on that note, I'm happy to say that we have 3 panel members who are more than capable of doing that. Please give a warm welcome to Jim Sillars, Alison Johnstone and Colin. I'm just going to explain the format of the event before we start. What's going to happen is that the 3 panel members are going to give a 10-minute speech on how they see independence in the first 10 years. And then we're going to go to 5 pre-selected questions, and the panel members are going to have 2 minutes each to answer those questions. That should take us to about 9 o'clock, and then we'll have half an hour for any other questions that you have. Okay? So the first speaker is Jim Sillars.
I'm going to start by being the awkward squad, because before I talk about what Scotland can be like if we're independent, I want you to think about what it's going to be like if we vote no in the referendum. I want to place our desire for independence in its historical context. We are at the final tail end of the fall of the English Empire. South of the border, there's decline and decay taking place. I mean, why should anybody think that the English Empire should be any different from the Spanish, Portuguese, Roman, and all the others that have gone before? All of them rise and all of them fall. We were attached to one for a period when it was rising. We're now attached to it in the period when it's falling, and falling quite precipitately. We're also at a great period in world history where there's a fundamental change taking place in where power resides in the world. For about the last 300–400 years, it's been the Atlantic axis that dominated the world economically and militarily. It's now, for the next 100, 200, 300 years, going to be the Asia-Pacific region that's going to dominate the world economically, and we don't know about militarily. Where do we fit Scotland in that historical situation? Do we remain like a small tugboat attached to the Titanic, going down along with England, or do we go our own separate way and try to do our own thing in an entirely different way and escape from what is going to happen south of the border? Now, I'm sorry about what's happening south of the border. I don't want to see visited upon the English people the decline that's now underway. But 5 million of us cannot sort out 55 million people and their problems south of the border. We've got to start thinking in Scottish state interest for the first time in 300 years. And if we don't vote yes, we're going to be stuck with a devolution parliament and a block grant. And we're going to be stuck with Joanne Lamont's ideas of attacking universal credits, because that block grant is going to be cut, and it's going to be cut, and it's going to be cut progressively over the years to come. The reason it's going to be cut is that by 2015, the United Kingdom national debt will be £1.5 trillion. Now, I looked up today, I didn't know what a trillion actually was. A trillion is figure 1 followed by 18 nothings. That's how large the debt is. And that's why they'll have to cut and cut and cut. And that's the future we're going to face. We had a lesson in John Swinney's so-called budget. John Swinney boasted, and it's no reflection on him personally, in case I get expelled. John Swinney boasted that we're going to build 6,880 new houses in the coming financial year. In North Lanarkshire, there are 14,000 people on a 5-year waiting list. According to Shelter, there's more than 25,000 folk waiting on a house in Edinburgh, which at the present rate of building will take 13 years to actually cure and solve. That's the future in a devolved Scotland, when we boast of 6,880 houses, when we probably need 60,000 a year. That's the future. And that's why I left the Labour Party. That's why I joined the Scottish National Party. Because I began to see way back in the 70s that no matter what was done south of the border, there was no salvation for us. Now, if we have sovereign power, I can't tell you what Scotland will be like in 10 years' time. I can tell you what I think needs to be done to transform us over the next decade. For example, we can cut the welfare budget, not by hammering the poor, but by giving people jobs. The more folk in work, the better the taxation, the less on social security and welfare benefits. Is that not a better policy than the one that we've got being imposed upon people at the present time? That's the priority. How do you do it? Well, I think we'll have to think outside the normal box when we're independent. Suddenly one day, you wake up and say, we can think what we like. There are no boundaries on our ability to think on policy terms and on ideas. None whatsoever. Take, for example, we've got youngsters who are now classed as underclass, who live in houses and homes where nobody's worked for 2 or 3 generations. What are we going to do about them? Well, why can't we have a look around and say, why can't we take the redundant assets that are there in the armed forces, the physical ones, the redundant assets that are there, the human assets, putting on the dole soldiers with engineering capability. And we've got a great problem of young folk with no skills and no hope and no prospects of a job, and put them together. Before I come out, I looked up the United States Corps of Engineers, Army Engineers. I thought they were all Army folk, but no. There are 38,000 of them, a mixture of civilian and Army. The civilians there are skilled people, and the Army there are skilled people, and they're used in civic construction inside the United States. They're the people who did the levees. Why can't we think along those lines? Why can't we act along those lines? Another priority for me is education. And let me nail my colours firmly to the mast. I'm utterly opposed, and I hope we'll never see in an independent Scotland any imposition of tuition fees upon our young people. Education has a dual purpose. One is obviously to educate and bring on a citizen who's worthwhile in the world. But it's also a tool of economic management. If we are to live in this Asia-Pacific dominated world, we've got to be able to find a niche for ourselves in a world where science and mathematics is going to count above all things. So we can start reorientating our education system in order to get a greater involvement in science and maths so that we can earn our place in the world. One of the things I think we'll have to get across to people is that small is not just beautiful, but small is agile. If you have a policy in Edinburgh and you apply it in Scotland, and bear in mind that 3 million of the 5 million live across the central belt from Dundee down to North Ayrshire. If it's going right, you very quickly know, because we're a small country, and you can reinforce it. If it's going wrong, you can quickly sort it out. Small countries in this world economy have the greatest benefit of agility. We can change relatively swiftly. That's why Denmark and Sweden and Finland and Norway, and by the way, Iceland as well now, are in any league table top of the world as far as prosperity is in fact concerned. Yes, I've got 1 minute, and can I just say this? We had better tell people, and I'll take a bet with anyone. If we vote no in 2014, by 2015, when most of the cuts are visited upon us, there will be bitter regret throughout the whole of Scotland, particularly among those who voted no, but it'll be too late. And I've got a message for those in the Labour movement. Out of the mouth of an old miner in Netherthird in Cumnock at a public meeting on Eva Pole in 1979, who got up and told the audience we need independence because history has shown every one of our socialist dreams have been destroyed by the London connection. Break that connection and the socialists can dream again.
Alison, Johnstone.
Thanks very much for inviting me this evening. I'm delighted to be here, and it's great to see such a big crowd. I actually took part in an independence debate at Napier on Wednesday. We had a huge lecture theatre, but not such a great attendance. Nonetheless, it was the start of a process of debate, and those who were there did enjoy it. I think it's fair to say that few Greens have national identity at the heart of their politics. It's not the reason I joined the party. And I think it's also fair to say that we openly accept that fact. There's debate within the party. And some of our members agree on independence, some don't. But what is very dear to our hearts is decentralisation. That is bringing political and economic structures and decision-making much closer to people. It's an important Green principle. But the majority of Greens do support independence and the Independence Convention. And this has been the case for as long as I've been a member, and I was actually trying to have a hunt through party records to see when we came to that policy, and it seems to be as far back as we have records. So why do Greens support independence? Well, we support it not out of nationalism, but because of our conviction that the transformation that we need to see in our society and our economy can best be achieved if Scotland is a small country. And what are those transformations? What would I like to change in the first decade after independence, or after a yes vote? I'm making a distinction on timing because some important changes that come about as part of the independence settlement, if there is to be one, will need to be brought in gradually. So let's look at Trident and NATO, for example. Weapons of mass destruction must be removed from Scotland. They are a disgusting insult to peace and a threat to our security. We're talking about the first 10 years here, so I had a look at how quickly this could happen. CND published a report this year with a useful timeline. In 7 days after independence, we could end the operational deployment of submarines and have them back in port. A day later, we could disable the missiles. In 8 weeks, we could have the warheads out of the submarines. A year later, disable them, and after 4 years, have them dismantled. Well within the decade. But I'd like to see Scotland go even further than just saying, not in our name or not in our backyard. We should be working at the forefront of efforts on non-proliferation and an international ban on nuclear weapons. I have a vision of Scotland as leading the way, a well-known beacon of peace in this world. I'd also like to see far more focus on truly local economies. Jim spoke about the need to be nimble on our feet, and I think that is essential with all the changes and challenges that we face. And I think this transformation will take longer than a decade to achieve. But a road we can start on is the creation of a truly local economy, one based on the creative entrepreneurial talents of our people running small and medium businesses. They have been absolutely hammered in the banking crisis. I know a trader in Brunsfield who's told me, the one thing that she'd like to fix at the moment is the banks. She's really successful. She can't get money from the banks. And her business has done incredibly well over the past 3 decades. And this isn't protectionist or a backward vision for the economy. We need local businesses that benefit more people. Local businesses keep money in the local economy. Local businesses are more likely to use local supply chains. A local economy can, as Jim was saying, be more resilient to shock and can operate more sustainably by sourcing local products and creating stronger communities. I don't know if you're aware that the Sainsbury's buyover of Peckham's has resulted in a group of people up at Bruntsfield getting together. They want to open a local shop selling local produce that's coming from allotments and things in the vicinity. They've just had enough of the multinational takeover that we're seeing on far too many high streets that's caused far too many businesses in this neck of the woods to close. We've lost fishmongers, we've lost butchers, and we're just getting fed of more and more of the same. But I think this has to be supported by progressive taxation and tax justice. Independence is an opportunity to start anew. Would we have the tax system we have in place just now if we started with a blank canvas? I don't think so. We've got an opportunity here for a simple and progressive tax policy, and one that supports the move to a local economy. I make no claims to be a tax expert, but the richest people and business in the UK avoided an estimated £25 billion in tax last year by using loopholes. These are legal. They simply shouldn't exist, and it's incredible that this still goes on. But that's enough to pay for all the cuts to public services being forced upon us, hitting the poorest hardest, and it's simply not fair. An independent Scotland is this chance to design a fair and simple system, free from loopholes and offshore tax havens, and employ enough people to collect a fair tax to pay for education, healthcare and support for these small businesses and local economies. I mentioned earlier some things that had to come in the years between the referendum and independence. This period represents a unique opportunity to go back to the drawing board on tax to make it simpler and fair, rather than simply importing the tax arrangements that we have from Westminster with all its inequality and inequity. We must take the time to properly negotiate the devolution of power and some fundamental changes so as not to inherit old, hardwired problems that will become intractable after independence. And finally, on tax. The SNP government want to cut corporation tax. This, in my opinion, is a regressive step and risks starting a risk to the bottom that I don't want to see. I did sit on the Scotland Bill Committee and we took evidence on this for several months, and it's my view that this is a dangerous step, certainly not one I would want to support. I think we really need to focus on making Scotland more attractive for our small and medium business people, rather than cutting corporation tax for the big multinationals. I want to come on to local energy. Scotland is rightly ambitious on renewable energy. We've got incredible renewable resources, but the profits and benefits from these must be more evenly distributed. People in many communities accept the impacts of renewable energy because they can see the environmental and financial benefits. If we look at wind farms, sometimes they're highly contentious, they cause a lot of disputes within communities, and I don't see why local people can't benefit from these. If they're built on common good land, why can't this money be fed back into the communities who are hosting them? I think we want to see far more of that kind of project. Local democracy, I think we certainly shouldn't see this as just copying Westminster at Holyrood. I'm personally not happy that we have a council tax freeze. I think local authorities deserve to have the opportunity to raise revenue themselves. The people on the ground know how much money they need. We've seen 7 great schools, 2 great nurseries closed in Edinburgh in the last year or two, simply because we don't have the cash. So I really do think that we need to give more power to local authorities, and they in turn should give more power to local communities. I think we'd see a complete revolution in our community councils if people thought they were going to get a pot of money. Here in Morningside, here's £100,000 or more, you can spend it on what your local community needs, because I think no one is better placed than those who live in an area to decide what they need. And I suppose that really is, in a nutshell, why I support independence.
Thank you very much, Lucy, and for inviting me. Thank you all for coming. I'm delighted to be here. I hope you forgive me. I've been sucking soothers for the last 20 minutes, so if Jim and Alison and Lucy doesn't took the flu this weekend, I try not to hold you responsible, but I got up at the demonstration last Saturday. I wanted to thank you all for coming. Obviously, I think all the speakers would say, if the four of us turned up and you didn't, it wouldn't be half the fun. So I want to thank you for coming. I also am delighted to share a platform with Alison and Jim, who are both distinguished political animals. Can I say that without sounding derogatory? As a fox, I'm an animal myself, obviously, but it's a delight to be here, and I think there's a whole lot in common between the three of us, and we'll investigate tonight what differences we have. But I think at the outset, I'd want to emphasise that the Scottish Socialist Party are proud to be part of the Yes Scotland campaign. We are passionate about independence. I wouldn't say we're more passionate than anybody else, but we're not less passionate than anybody else for our vision of an independent socialist Scotland. And I'm sure there was people here, I'm pretty certain, if you think back to 2005, when we launched the Scottish Independence Convention, a fantastic evening at the Dynamic Earth way back then, where the Scottish Socialist Party, the Scottish National Party and the Greens, as well as other partners from across Civic Scotland, founded the Scottish Independence Convention way back then. And you might forgive me if I refer to 2005, and from where I stand as the leader of the Scottish Socialist Party, that seems like an awful long time ago, given what I've been through since then. But anyway, we'll gloss over that and get to the point of tonight's meeting. I'm delighted to be able to share the vision that I have and the Scottish Socialist Party has for that period in 2024, is that right? Is that 10 years after we won the referendum and independence? We're all delighted to be able to sit and bask and think of ourselves as playing what a fantastic role we all played in that referendum in 2014. We won it so handsomely that we now have the luxury to consider 10 years afterwards what it's going to be like. And I would say to you that I would want to make clear, and I've done so in all the meetings, Yes Scotland campaign from the Scottish Socialist Party's perspective, that supporting a country's right to self-determination does not make you a nationalist per se. In my view, it makes you a democrat. It's a democratic right of a people to determine their own future. And I stand here in front of you as a socialist who's passionate about independence, but I simply stand as the latest socialist in a long line, and Jim mentioned the South Ayrshire socialist. I'm sure he was the only one. But John Maclean, the great leader of Red Clydeside, was a passionate advocate of independence for Scotland. Perhaps the greatest socialist that Edinburgh produced before me, James Connolly, was another passionate advocate of independence for Scotland, for Ireland and elsewhere. Lenin and the Bolsheviks were other great advocates of self-determination for the peoples of the Soviet Union. You could go on and on and on. The point I'm simply making is that the socialist tradition is a long one, and there are socialists who for centuries have supported the idea that the peoples of a country and a nation like ours are perfectly entitled to have that right to determine their own future. And perhaps more closer to home, people in this audience would probably remember the remarks, I think very enlightened remarks, Jimmy Reid made when he distinguished Scotland as a nation, Britain as a state. And for me, I always make it clear, I try to make it clear, there is no such country as Britain. We watched the Olympics and then the Paralympics for the best part of 2 months this summer, and we heard repeatedly commentators talk about the country, meaning Britain. Of course, Britain is not a country, and Great Britain is made up of at least 3 countries, and possibly 4, without getting into the politics of the north of Ireland, the unification of Ireland. So this error, which is commonplace, does Scotland a disservice, and I think we're entitled repeatedly to make clear that Scotland is entitled to be treated as a nation, just like any other. And I think the First Minister and others, Jim and Alison, myself, made it clear, we're not saying that Scotland's entitled to greater rights than any other country in the world. We're simply saying we're entitled to the same rights as any other country in the world, to nationhood and statehood, and to determining our future. And like Jim, I would say that in my vision of Scotland 10 years after independence, I would stand in front of you and say that the break-up of the British state is a welcome step. It's an attractive proposition in a whole variety of different ways. Because Britain today, in my view, is not only in decline and has been in economic and political decline for a long time, it's also at the epicentre of a vicious, brutal, neoliberal economic system whose tentacles reach to almost every part of the world. And you can sometimes think that Britain's empire has gone, and of course it has. But you can forget that Britain's still the 5th biggest army in the world, the 5th biggest expenditure on defence in the world. It's still in Afghanistan. It was still one of the few countries in Iraq. It's covertly organised in Syria today, as it was involved in overthrowing regimes in Libya. And they say in international law, regime change is not the business of Britain or America or anywhere else. It's illegal. But we see in front of us, Britain is constantly involved in regime change throughout the world. And I have to say, Scotland's attachment to that brings us only shame. It brings us shame that there are Scottish soldiers today occupying Afghanistan. It brings us shame that there are young laddies and lassies who were involved in Iraq with Scottish uniforms. That brings shame in our country. And I remember the words that I hold dear. Hamish Henderson, another famous Scottish socialist, supporter of independence, radical Republican, in the ballad, The Freedom Camalgie, he talks about how in some parts of the world, the skirl of the bagpipes and the sight of tartan is synonymous with hatred and fear and loathing in far too many parts of the world, because for them it was associated with the British Army. And that's the legacy, that's the terrible price we have paid as Scots for our part as part of the British state. And I make no apologies for standing here in front of you and say I, for one, will welcome Scotland's departure from the British state and be part of that legacy and history. And I wanted to say this, in my remarks as a socialist, I lived in London for 10 years, I loved it. I don't consider that as a Scot I'm oppressed by the English. I don't consider myself as a Scot I'm oppressed by London, whatever that means, or even by Westminster. Because inherent within it is that I, as a Scot, all of us here, we are oppressed by people who are unelected, who are unaccountable, and they're the multinational corporations of this country and Britain who have such power and immense wealth and power, and yet we do not control them. I had to laugh when I was in the Scottish Parliament. You'd meet people and say, so this is where we run the country? And I says, no, I'm afraid that's somewhere else. The Scottish Parliament's budget when I was there, £30 billion a year. At that time, the Royal Bank of Scotland was making profits of more than £30 billion a year. Not its turnover annually. And I remember asking the school kids who used to come into the Parliament, hands up here who thinks Jack McConnell tells the Royal Bank of Scotland what to do. And hands up who thinks it's the reverse. And of course it's the reverse. And it remains the case that not so much the Royal Bank of Scotland, God love their soul, long departed. I remember being at a meeting of the MSPs, Lucy. All the MSPs for the Lothians were invited to the City Chambers to meet Sir Jeremy Peat, who at that time was the chief economist of the Royal Bank of Scotland. He makes this presentation. The world's richest bank is based here in Edinburgh. And I think he thought we were all supposed to go, we are not worthy, the Royal Bank of Scotland at Gogurburn. And he makes his presentation about how great they were, how fantastic they were. They took over ABN AMRO, they were unstoppable as the world's most profitable bank. And in that pause between, they went, any questions? The 7 or 8 MSPs are waiting to see who would be first, and I knew if I didn't get in first, I'd never get in. And I asked them, what would you say to the Royal Bank of Scotland being publicly owned? And all those profits you take, instead of going to shareholders, went to build houses, council houses, went to provide schools for our kids, health services, etc. And Sir Jeremy, as he was wont to do, looked round my colleagues and said famously, I don't think that'll ever happen. And I always took that to mean he had the other politicians in his pocket, but of course he couldn't be more wrong, because now it has happened. Not in the way that he imagined it, that the Royal Bank of Scotland went bust. I want to see the Royal Bank of Scotland remain in public hands when it's profitable, and when it makes the money, the profits that it makes, go to build the council houses that Jim talked about, the regeneration projects that Alison talked about, the schooling that my kids and your kids need in this city, and so much else. That's the vision of Scotland I have for the future. I make no bones about it. I'm in favour of an independent socialist Scotland that's a modern democratic republic where you and I, the people of this country, are in charge of this country, and where we run the country as citizens of the country and not subjects of anyone else. Thank you very much.
We're going to have 5 pre-selected questions now. The first one is from Barry.
Hi. I've asked data, sorry, excuse the better data, which I don't normally use. The question to the platform basically is, do the speakers agree, and I think what they said they probably do, that the shameful complicity of UK governments in facilitating ever-burgeoning inequality in society throughout the past 30 years is the key issue in winning Scottish independence, and that recognising that all elements of societal welfare and social cohesion are best served by a more equal society, the Yes campaign should commit itself unequivocally to prioritising the reversal of the trend of a widening gap between rich and poor, to targeting the eradication of poverty in Scotland and a historically low ratio of income of the financial elite to the national average wage, and a fairer distribution of all the wealth of Scotland. And if so, how do they feel this could best be achieved, and what do they view as the likely impacts and indeed the pitfalls of pursuing this policy in the first 10 years of independence?
Thanks very much.
Yes. This will please Colin, because we've actually got to look at the equation between capital and labour. When you've got heavy unemployment, labour is in a very, very poor bargaining position indeed. It's a fact. If you don't like this job, there are 20, 30 outside who will in fact take it. That's why I put the emphasis on jobs. I actually believe in full employment. Not regarded as a nutcase by many people, many economists. I don't think there's any problem about creating full employment. If you look around this society of ours, there's work crying out to be done. Just simple. If you look at the closes in the Edinburgh tenements, probably nearly every one of them needs to be upgraded. We need to make sure that what we would call the Scottish real estate, that's our folks' houses and homes in the tenemental areas in Edinburgh, Glasgow and Dundee, need constantly to be maintained and upgraded. So there's work there requiring to be done. So if we engineer economic policies in an independent Scotland, which we're not able to do at the moment, one of the sad things for me as a member of the SNP is that Alex Salmond and John Swinney keep telling us that our unemployment's no as bad as south of the border, as though devolution was a working factor in a plus sense, and it's not. But if we engineer our economic policy correctly, progressively over the next decade after we vote yes, then we'll shift the balance of wealth and power to the working people and their families, if I can borrow from a Labour Party manifesto way back in the 1980s, the 70s actually. Once you do that, then you start to produce a better ratio between what the top people earn and what the average worker earns. We can, of course this is a 10-year period, but we can start almost immediately. I don't understand why we should pay bonuses to senior officials in public services for doing the work they're extremely well paid for doing in the very first place. My one regret is that I will not be in the first Scottish Government in charge of the economy. But if I were, I would tell the public sector, doesn't matter whether it's the NHS or Edinburgh Council or Glasgow or anybody else, that from now on we work progressively to the point where the top person's ratio to the average worker is 13 to 1, not 22 to 1 or 40 to 1 or 50 to 1 as it is at the present time. That way you start to get equality of income. But more importantly, you start to change the psychology of a society. You start to make a society understand that it's okay about the wages, but there's a whole range of other things where we've got to make people equal. I don't know, if nobody's read it, you should get a book called The Spirit Level. It's a very interesting book. The United Kingdom and the United States of America are the most unequal countries in the developed world. Now, you would perfectly expect that the lower end of that income scale die earlier than other countries. But so does the higher end of that income scale. Strange to say, it affects everybody in that society. Whereas if you go to Sweden, where it is round about 12, 11, 13 to 1, then you find that everybody, whether it's the 1 or the 13, actually live longer and have healthier lives. So I think that we start shifting the balance between capital and labour, then we start on that way. And if we also tell folk, no, you don't get any bonus for doing public service for which you're well paid, then I think we start to build up the equality agenda.
I would just say to Barry that I think this is the absolute priority. It is the 21st century. This is 2014. Leave aside the dreams of 2024. We have in Scotland today 1 million households living in fuel poverty. On Monday, Scottish and Southern Electric put up the price of gas and electricity by another 9%. There's already 1 million households in the country can't afford to pay for gas and electricity as we begin yet another winter. This is Scotland. This is one of the richest countries in the world. This is the 21st century. There are children in this city who won't have proper footwear for this winter. There are children in this city who are hungry every single day. There are children in this city and every city and town in Scotland. Holidays. What's a holiday, Mr. Fox? I was speaking at Granton Primary School on Monday. I was speaking to the P7 kids. They've been down to Parliament, they're doing a project, preparing themselves for high school. And I was talking to the kids in Granton Primary. And you speak to a lot of them. And I asked them if they've been on holiday abroad, they've been to Spain and Italy. Some of them had. More than 2/3 of them hadn't been. They're 10 or 11-year-old, they haven't been out of the country. The idea that the things that we're entitled to take for granted are available to everybody are denied a third of our kids. Pensioners denied dignity in employment and retirement, I should say. A couple of weeks' time I'll be in a demonstration like I was last Saturday, 20th of October, marching through Glasgow in protest at the government's attempts to cut the pensions of public sector staff. You retire in local government, a woman in retirement in local government gets a pension of £3,300 a year on average to retire with. It's scandalous. And these inequalities, quite frankly, are a disgrace. They bring shame in every single person in this room. And I bring it contemporary if I can. You heard the news today, as I'm sure I did, in France. They just increased the top rate of tax today, did you see? To earners earning more than €1 million a year, the top rate of tax is just increased to 75 pence in the pound. And you had Conservative and Labour politicians on Radio 4 at tea time saying, well, let them move to London because it's only 45 pence in the pound here. Let them flood to London. And I have to say, I come from the Labour movement. Where I come from, that's called scabbing. That's social scabbing. My attitude would be if you're a Euro millionaire and you live in France and you're French, you should stay there and you should contribute to the society that you're part of. You shouldn't run away to London because you pay 45 pence in the pound in your taxes and then go back to another country, chase around the world to see where the lowest taxes are. That's scandalous. And I have to say, I was at University of Strathclyde. I left University of Strathclyde, went to Bell College, and I stand before you with no tie. And that's to show you, it's to put you off my scent a wee bit. I qualified as a chartered accountant. And I always remember saying chartered accountancy drove me to Trotskyism. Because my job as a chartered accountant, I'd have a client. There's only one job I had to do for that client. Whether they're a hairdresser, whether they're a shipping magnate that I represented up in Mulgai, and I won't tell you his name, it's no important, dead now anyway. My job as a chartered accountant was to avoid taxes for the client. I used to meet with the Revenue Customs and Revenue, Inland Revenue is called the Inspector, and I'd show them these beautifully prepared sets of accounts. I was so proud of them every year. That's my hard work, Alison. I've worked on that. You wouldn't believe the work I went into. He took one look at it and he went, aye, listen, we want £1 million in your tax bill. And my job and the partner's job was to say, no, £1 million, we'll give you 100,000. And we'd settle somewhere in the middle at 300,000, and the partner and the client and the tax man would go and play golf with my guy. My accounts were an irrelevance. But I knew, I learned, and every kid that does accountancy will learn, Lucy, that tax loopholes are political products. They're prepared, a loophole, they know they don't fall out of the sky. We have a government today. We know every tax inspector in the country, every accountant in the country knows where the loopholes are. They know what they are. They help design them. And they're there. In my view, they're utterly corrupt. You're allowed to put this off against your expenses, you're allowed to put that off against your profits, etc. And they're allowed to reduce their taxes. It's a scandal. And I tell you one thing, if I can only pass on one of many of the great things I learned with chartered accountancy is, you'll never be a millionaire if you're in PAYE. It's impossible. If you want to be a millionaire, you get off of PAYE and you go into tax band A, B or D, and that's how you get to offset forests that you might grow in the Highlands against your taxes as a hairdresser. You wouldn't believe the loopholes that are there. The fact of the matter is they are political, and therefore we have political opportunities to stop those loopholes. Other countries in the world would laugh at you if you showed them the tax code and the tax rates and loopholes that exist in Britain. So for me, I have to say that I look forward to a Scotland where we sit down and we say to people, look, you're part of our society and you contribute towards it. If you're poor, you get a hand up. And the richer and better off people, they make a contribution to show they're part of society by paying a higher rate of tax because they're higher rewarded. And that's the kind of society I think we all want to live in. And I'd only say this in finishing that ergo, it's also true that the sickest societies, in my view, it's clear, the sickest societies are those with the greatest inequalities. And the most grotesque inequalities in the world today are in the United States of America, quickly followed by Great Britain.
Fact. I think it's a great big juicy question, Barry. Thanks very much. I'm really heartened to see, your question is, should the Yes campaign make this one of the sort of fundamentals? And personally, I would say yes. This could have come straight out of the Green Party policy, and probably a lot of other party policy too. And I think people outside there, the undecided, that great big group of people who don't know what they're going to do yet, they need to be convinced, they need to know why they should vote yes. And I think if you start to put forward this kind of idea, I think that will attract a lot of people. It's absolutely true. The two most unequal societies in the world are the United States and our own. And is it any coincidence that the two fattest societies in the world are the United States and our own? Now, we both have cultures where supermarkets are the norm, where you jump in your car to drive around the corner. There's a lot of that as well, but there are, a Finnish psychiatrist has done a study, and he's wondering if there's a link with obesity and unhappiness, that we're just sort of comforting ourselves. And I certainly think that's something that we should think about. And the spirit level, it's mentioned everywhere just now, but there's another really good book called Affluenza by a chap called Oliver James. And in it, he just talks about the fact that people are just obsessed with earning money. They don't even know why they want it. And a lot of his research suggests that after a certain amount of money, if you're earning sort of mid-20s, happiness doesn't increase. There's no great correlation. You don't become happier and happier. But what we do have are a lot of people who are absolutely struggling to make ends meet every day. And I do think we can change that around. You were asking how we would sort of go about boosting the Scottish economy. Well, we would advocate insulating every home in Scotland. The Builders Federation are really supportive of that. There's a lot of work needing done. We could have apprenticeships in how to treat the hard to treat houses that we see all the way around Brunsfield. Houses where you can't just pump cavity wall insulation in the walls. People need to treat these very, very carefully. So there's a whole new industry there waiting to boom. I think as well, in Scotland, I think we're really, politicians love unveiling plaques and go, wow, look at this new sports centre, or look at this new housing estate on the odd occasion that we unveil a new housing estate. But what we're not so good at is maintaining what we have. You know, I think in this city, Meadowbank is falling apart, the velodrome's an utter disgrace, we've closed Leith Waterworld. Why don't we maintain the facilities we invest in? So I think there are a lot of opportunities for employment there. I mean, we've obviously got huge potential in renewables to generate lots of jobs, lots of income that should be shared equally across society. In Edinburgh, I think the council here now has said there'll be no more than, the lowest paid person will not earn less than 12 times the chief executive. But I'd like us to go a bit further. I don't see why that shouldn't be a ratio of 1 to 10. I think that's absolutely adequate for anybody. I mean, I just think, how much money does any one person need? And I really do think we have to begin this a sort of transformation from the unsustainable economic model we're using, our dependence on fossil fuels. There's loads of jobs to be had in creating joined up cycleways, joined up footpaths. I think we don't invest enough in the people who are doing really important work. Carers are completely overlooked, unsupported. Those providing childcare, one of the most important jobs you could possibly do, in my opinion. I mean, their pay is laughable. I mean, I really do think it's absolutely offensive that these people are paid so little when they're doing such an important task, and I'd like to see that. We really need to have a very good look at that. But I think there's a lot we can do. We can build a great society, and we can do it while living within our ecological means. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take question 2 and question 3 both at the same time. So question 2 is from Merlin.
Thankfully short. Do the panel think that an independent Scotland would be welcomed around the world, or might there be efforts to undermine it?
And question 3 from Paolo.
Independent Scotland, what kind of card would you use when I said free?
Sorry, could you repeat that again, please?
Okay.
A bit louder.
In independent Scotland, what kind of card would you use when I said free?
The question was, do you think what countries should Scotland align itself with internationally post-independence? Yes?
Yeah.
Do you want to go first?
Sure. So, the first question was, would people accept an independent Scotland? I think it's fair to say there will be a lot of heated debate around the referendum. I mean, undoubtedly. The hustings I was at the other night, we were asked how did we think people would react if there was a narrow defeat? And what would the atmosphere be like on the street? And I'm sure there would be, a great intake of breath and a lot of sighing and perhaps a lot of jubilation on the part of those who've won. But I do think the decision will be accepted. What other choice is there? If we're clear on what the question is, if the question has been accepted as entirely fair, then I think the result will be accepted. I mean, it absolutely must be accepted. And I think people have to realise that the vote will reflect the democratic will of the Scottish people. I think we've got a lot of work to do though, making sure that everyone has the opportunity to vote, because I know when I go out canvassing that in some tenements there are very few people who are on the electoral roll. And I'm kind of hoping that as the debates come on and it gets more interesting, a lot of people will want to engage. And I think we really need to have a big public campaign making sure that everybody who has a right to vote can do so. I'd certainly, I just can't see that we would, that we wouldn't be accepted. I'm sure we would. I think Scotland's a very welcoming country. Colin's expressed concerns about, the reservations that our associations with some activities might have across the world. But, I know whenever I'm, having the opportunity to travel or meet people from overseas, generally I think they're welcoming and they realise that we're welcoming. I think we'd certainly have a far more welcoming immigration policy, for example. I don't think we'd be holding women and children and asylum seekers in the conditions that they currently have to tolerate too often. So, yes, I think we would be welcomed.
Yeah, some countries or peoples or nations in the world will not be the least bit bothered whether we're independent or not. I once stood at the back of a hall while a candidate said the eyes of the world are upon us, and I said to my pal, God, I hope no. I don't think people in China, Indonesia, Thailand, Hong Kong, Taiwan, going to be Pakistan are going to be the least bit bothered one way or another whether we're independent or not. Some people will be worried. I think the United States will be a bit worried because its junior lieutenant will be somewhat diminished, at least territorially, and that might create a problem in respect of its position on the Security Council of the United Nations, where it's going to be continually difficult for the UK to sustain its argument that it's entitled to that particular veto-wielding seat. I think the Spanish government will be very unhappy about that, very unhappy indeed, and so will some other countries inside the European Union. So I think it will be a mix throughout the world. But I mean, I don't think we should all think that everybody, are holding their breath as to what this small country is in fact going to do. Compared to the problems of China and Indonesia and Thailand, we are actually internationally small beer. Who should we align ourselves with? Well, that's a foreign policy question, but it's also got important economic implications in the first 10 years. I told you earlier that we're heading for 1.5 trillion of a UK national deficit, or a budget debt. Well, on independence, we'll have to take something like 8.4% of that national debt. When you break up a country, that's happened elsewhere, so there's nothing unusual about it. There's the question of assets and liabilities, and the division of assets and liabilities, and there'll be all sorts of negotiations, but fundamentally, we'll have to take about 8.4 of that 1.5 trillion with its 17 nothings. Which means that we'll have to be extremely careful who we align ourselves with, or how we align ourselves, and at what level, political or economic, that we align ourselves with. And we should take a very, very careful analysis of where our economic interests lie from 2014-16 onwards. And that's where you start to align yourself with. That's much more important, I believe, than politically. I think, obviously, in the cultural, political, economic sphere, where the Scots have emigrated to, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and other parts of the Commonwealth, I think that's very important as well. I think the countries where we have, in the past, invaded, have long forgotten, or it's just part of their folklore. I don't think they're going to hold it against us in any way whatsoever. But you've got economies like India, economies like Indonesia, and Thailand, and the Philippines, which is a growing economy in Asia, and China. Economically, I think we better start aligning ourselves with the economic possibilities there. That's not to say we sign up with the Chinese Communist Party, which has gone a bit far, even for Colin.
I think it's really important that we maintain very good relationships with our United Kingdom partners. I think we'll continue to trade and have close links with those countries. So I think the UK, Northern Europe, we're constantly, I hear myself constantly talking about Scandinavia, and I haven't taken the time to visit these countries that I'm always saying, look at their childcare policies, look at how many people cycle there, look at how brilliant this is. I think these are countries who, share similar characteristics to ourselves. The weather's not dissimilar, and I think we should have a good look at why quality of life there appears to be better. So I'd certainly like to work closely there. I think work together with people with whom we have shared interests, and be careful with those we have concerns about. In a nutshell, that's what I'd say. Thank you.
Can I just say I'm struck by how Colin Fox even sounds Chinese. So Chinese Communist Party maybe helped me after all. The way the Labour Party never seemed to want me. To answer the questions, would an independent Scotland be welcomed around the world? I think that it's probably in front of everybody's, like your nose in your face. The key question is, what would the rest of the UK's response be to an independent Scotland? You get this, we see this laid out in front of us a lot. the growing support for Scottish independence there is in England. But I think that's very much a barbed remark. You know, it's like, bugger them, let them beat it. They don't want to be part of us, we don't want to be part of them, kind of thing, right? But I think that the interesting thing will be the rest of the UK will have to respond to how Scotland votes in the referendum in 2014. And my feeling is, I think that there's no any question that they will respond and say that's the wishes of the Scottish people and we respect it. And I think that's the right thing for them to do. I'm also long enough in the tooth to know that the United States of America didn't respect the Chilean people's rights to elect a government of Salvador Allende in 1971. They didn't respect the rights of the Cuban people in 1959 to elect the government of those. They didn't respect the rights of the Nicaraguan people to elect the government and determine their own future. So I'm not completely starry-eyed about it. I would entirely accept that this isn't the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s. Clearly the world has moved on, and so has America in many ways. The United States will probably feel that they can deal with independent countries and can manipulate them and can, you know, get things done there, whether they're independent or not. So I think that's something that it doesn't fill me with any great alarm. I'm interested in how these countries would respond to it, but they have to respect fundamentally our democratic right to determine our own future. And I do think Jim touches on a very interesting point about Spain. And Monday night, or was it the Tuesday before we marched in Edinburgh, 1.5 million people marched through Barcelona on a Tuesday evening, and Catalonia's population, correct me if I'm wrong, is about 4.5–5 million. For 1.5 million people, you turn up on a Tuesday night and assert their right for independence for Catalonia within the context of Spain. It's a very, very powerful message indeed, and I can see entirely why the Spanish government would be worried about independence for Scotland leading to or amplifying the desire for independence for Catalonia, for the Basque Country, for Galicia, and other parts of Spain, Andalusia, etc., who want their independence. But of course, that's not our concern, that's the concern of the peoples and the nations of those countries. On what kind of countries should Scotland align itself to? Again, for foreign policy and economic reasons, I think the first places we align ourselves to are what's been referred to as our UK. The rest of the UK, after independence, England will still be where it is currently. Carlisle will still be 3 or 4 miles from Annan, or however it is just now. You know, we'll remain strong trading partners with England, Wales and the Irish state. I think further than that, I look towards countries that are currently countries that I very much admire. I look at Norway, can't actually see it from here, but across the North Sea, smaller than us, a country with very many of the problems that we had. Now the country in every United Nations survey tops the league for quality of life, standard of living. And I think that's a country that Scotland can learn from. I think it's a country Scotland should have close ties with. Of course we do at the moment. Scandinavia, as Alison said. I would also have to say that as a socialist, I'm very much heartened and encouraged by the transformation in Latin America that's taken place in the last 10 or 20 years, for all those military police dictatorships, Nicaragua, Guatemala, El Salvador, etc. Latin America is a continent that is much more progressively aligned, much more independent from the United States of America than it's been before. I look forward, I'm sure you might too, to the election of Hugo Chavez next month in Venezuela. And I think that's a very welcome development in a part of the world that is perhaps swimming against the stream, and it can't be easy that way. So I hope also that Scotland becomes in itself a beacon to other countries in the world, that we show the world that ours is an enlightened people, ours is an educated population, ours is a population that rather than wanting to threaten the rest of the world with nuclear annihilation, we'd like to be known as peacemongers rather than warmongers the world over. And in our hearts of hearts, I'm sure you'll agree, that's the epicentre. That's where the people of Scotland's heart really lies. And I believe that an independent Scotland can also add to that great welfare of advance for the nations of the world.
Thanks very much. I'm going to take question 5 before question 4. And that's from John.
My question to the panel is, how does their
What did you say there at the end?
So they only have 2 minutes.
I feel as if I only need 2 seconds. I don't think Joanne can spell the word vision. I mean, I think she's in danger of being called Joanne Lamentable. I had to laugh, honestly, God, was it yesterday? It seems like an awful long time, maybe it was only today. To hear the Labour Party in Scotland say to attack the SNP government for introducing free prescription charges, the world has turned upside down. The world is totally in its head. When the Labour Party thinks that it's going to make political capital in this country by criticising, attacking those things that we as a nation hold dearest about the achievements of the Scottish Parliament since 1999. Free tuition fees. No tuition fees, free prescriptions, care for the elderly, free care for the elderly, and free travel. And the other thing in my last remaining few seconds that also made me hysterical almost was when David Miliband today joined the crusade in The Guardian and was suggesting it was appalling for somebody like Alan Sugar to be given a free bus pass. I had to think to myself, I couldn't even imagine in all my wildest visions, I can't even imagine Alan Sugar on a London bus. The idea that these people travel by bus is preposterous. So David Miliband is putting forward a policy to take something away from somebody that's never ever likely to use it. It's never likely to happen. It's hard to imagine a Labour Party so bereft of ideas. It really is so bereft of ideas that they think that's a wise place to position themselves politically now in Scotland and Britain.
Joanne Lamont has a point, of course. If you're talking about a devolved parliament with a fixed budget that is going down year after year, inevitably you have to question every single policy and you have to cut. That's the reality that we're facing at the present time. Over the next 10 years, the money that they've got in the Scottish Parliament just now is very, very much greater than the money they're going to have year after year after year. So there's a logic to what she's saying. I just wish the Scottish people understood the logic. That's our future. And it will be unavoidable. There'll be no way around it. Because about 90% of the Scottish, look, it's not a budget at all. Let's get the terminology correct. A budget is when you determine the spending priorities and then determine how you're going to bring in the revenue to pay for it. We've got a block grant which is distributed by the Scottish Parliament. That's what we've got. And 90% of that block grant is already predetermined where it's going. Even on frozen wages, you've still to pay the nurses, the firemen, the doctors, and all the other things, the teachers, and all the rest of it. These are things you must meet. And when you've met them, you're about 10% discretion left to you. And as that budget goes down, that 10% becomes a bigger problem how you're going to manage it. So what she's actually pointing to is the future for universal services if we remain in a devolved Scotland and not an independent one. And I would beg people, as well as attacking Joanne Lamont, so this is ridiculous, point out why she's taking that position. Because that's the position everybody, and let me tell you, if we vote no, I don't care what government it is, after 2015, 2016, every government up here will be driven into cutting universal services because they'll have no alternative whatsoever. What I regret is that I'm seeing a Labour movement which is intellectually bankrupt, has no imagination whatsoever. Does she not get up in the morning and think, there must be an alternative to looking at tuition fees, to cutting the bus pass and the prescription charges. There must be an alternative and the alternative is being offered by the Yes campaign. That's what we've got to point out to people. Of course, you can fiddle about with a bus pass. I mean, I've got a bus pass. And if the choice came morally between preserving every aspect of my bus pass and taking money from the education of my grandchildren, I'll sacrifice part of the bus pass. Of course I will. We shouldn't be forced to make that decision. We're a rich country. You know, folk talk about oil, and I haven't talked about it from the SNP tonight on. I'm not going to talk about the oil. What I'm going to talk about is the big manufacturing industry in the decommissioning of the oil rigs in the North Sea over the next 10 years. It's a cornucopia for us if we in fact gear ourselves up to it. We shouldn't need to choose between an old age pensioner's bus pass and her grandchildren's education. And as for tuition fees, it sticks in my craw that the ones who've attacked the youngsters over the years are the very ones who benefited not just from free tuition fees, but from grants that allowed them to stay debt-free. We are now in a position south of the border. How would you like to be a medical student at £9,000 a year? How the hell are you ever going to be able to pay that off, get married and get a mortgage? Not possible. At least up here, we've kept the student debt low. But I would go further in an independent Scotland. I would get rid of the student loans as well, because the student loans, no matter how we fix them, loads our youngsters with debt. Universities should be wide open doors for the young people of Scotland to go in, to become well educated, in order to become not only good citizens in their own country, but good citizens able to understand the world that they are in fact living in. And what Joanne Lamont's done is reverse 100 years of Labour history, and she should be black burning shame on herself.
I think it's fair to say that Joanne Lamont's ears must be burning. So how does my vision of Scotland differ from Joanne Lamont's? I have to say I am absolutely astonished that the two things she has mentioned have been prescriptions and education. I mean, I just think there's such strength in those being universally free to everyone at the point of use. I mean, we are all paying taxes, so I do get fed up with this free thing. You know, it really does get on my nerves. We're all paying for these services through taxation, and I think there's great benefits to everyone in society if we're all using them. It avoids any stigma whatsoever, and it helps even those who could afford to pay to see who they're benefiting and why it's so important. And yeah, I'm fairly astonished that she has taken this stance, but I do respect her right to question any policy, and I think, you know, it's healthy that we do continue to question every penny we're spending, as Jim said. I think my vision of Scotland would be one where we think more about our well-being than our gross domestic product. You know, if there's an oil spill and we have to spend billions of pounds cleaning that up, well, our GDP skyrockets. Oh, isn't that fantastic? Clearly it's not. If we have a lot of people unwell in hospital and we're having to pay to have them treated, our GDP improves. Isn't that great? Of course it's not. We need to be looking at the health of our nation. So I'd like to see far more emphasis on prevention, and I can kind of see that happening because we won't have polluted streets, or everyone will have access to a nice park, a park that's well looked after and it doesn't have broken glass and perhaps the odd syringe and stuff hanging about. I think we need to spend far more time looking at the sort of communities we want to live in. You know, I want to see a really sort of integrated, happy, healthy Scotland, and I think we can get there. I'm pleased that the Scottish Government is working with Joe Stiglitz, who's a leading economist who takes all these things into account. Oxfam have produced recently what they call a humankind index, where we're looking at our well-being. Because I think UNICEF did a study a couple of years ago, and it showed in terms of happiness and well-being, our children were way down the bottom globally, and you know, that's just an absolute travesty when we live in such a wealthy country. And you know, as has been alluded to, that is all about the choices we make and the way we decide to spend our money. I mean, currently we're spending billions on 19th century warfare. What is that all about? And I do think that this campaign is a chance to make the kind of transformations that we really have to get serious about making. Thank you.
Okay, finally, the last question is from Paul. I can ask panel members to keep your answers to 2 minutes, please, because we're going to give the floor for further questions. So, Paul.
Yes, thank you. Do you think Scotland's armed service should be geared towards genuine defence of our own people, or continue to be deployed under someone else's name in conflicts abroad?
Okay, so the question is, do you think Scotland's armed services should be geared towards genuine defence of our own people, or continue to be deployed under someone else's name and in conflicts abroad?
Yes.
Do you want to answer that first?
I think it's a really good question. You know, I'm a big fan of George Orwell, and the word defence doesn't mean defence anymore. The word defence means attack. When we talk about our defence expenditure, it's about the amount of money we're going to spend, not in defending our country per se, but buying weapons, whether it's weapons of mass destruction, British aerospace weapons, whether it's taking on more soldiers, etc. And I have to say, for me, I listen to the debates on TV about NATO, about defence, etc. And I think, who is it we're defending ourselves from? Who is it we're defending ourselves from? We seem to be doing all the attacking. The Iraqis weren't any threat to me, but we invaded their country. The Afghans aren't any threat to me, 30 million in the second poorest country in the world, but we're occupying their country. There's only 9 countries in the world, I think it is, with nuclear weapons, and we're one of them. And I think to myself, how many other 250 countries in the world? 9 with nuclear weapons, Scotland's one of them, unfortunately. And I think the whole tenor of the debate is, like George Orwell himself would recognise, is turned upside down entirely. And I think I'm in favour of defending ourselves. I'm in favour of we vote for an independent Scotland, as is our right, and we do it in 2014. Anybody who wants to take that away from us shouldn't be allowed to. We should defend our right to take our decision, defend ourselves for our country. But I think the whole debate on defence is totally out of proportion. I don't think it's right that Scotland spends such an enormous part of our economy and our expenditure, albeit through the British state, as I mentioned before, as we do. And I have to say, the last thing I say, Alison, I grew up in Motherwell. I'm from Motherwell. I remember growing up in Motherwell, and it was a town synonymous with manufacturing steel. There was the Ravenscraig, there was the DL, there was the Clydesdale, there was the Clyde Alloy. I could go through them all. My granda was a welder with the Lanarkshire Welding Company. I remember the BMC factory in Bathgate, British Leyland. I remember Linwood Chrysler car factory. We could go through manufacturing in Scotland, and I've only got a second or two, so I'm not going to. But the only volume manufacturing that seems to be Scotland makes anymore is defence. The only shipyards, the only things we produce in the Clyde or at Rosyth are aircraft carriers, Ministry of Defence contracts. Look at the ferry road in Edinburgh. Is there anywhere else in Edinburgh we make anything? We don't make biscuits anymore. But in the ferry road you've got British Aerospace, you've got Marconi, you've got GEC. You look around Scotland and we spend an inordinate amount of our money on making weapons and selling them, it seems to me, to any dictator around the world who wants to buy them. And I have to say, as a socialist, as someone who's a member of CND, I'm not in favour of that. I'd rather we took, and I'm a member of Trident Ploughshares, I'd rather we took the jobs and the people who are working at Faz Lane, Rosyth, on the shipyards in the Clyde, on the ferry road in Edinburgh, and we made things that are productive and are beneficial to mankind, rather than that we make things that help mankind blow each other to smithereens.
Yeah, sure. I do agree with Colin entirely. I mean, we all know the saying, attack is the best form of defence, and we seem to be living that. And I think in the 21st century, it's just high time we need to find what does defence mean? I think Colin said, who are we defending ourselves from? We're part of this big nuclear industry. And you know, people will say, oh well, if we don't have all this defence and all this weapons manufacturing, what about all the jobs? Well, all these skills are perfectly transferable and they'll go down really well in the renewables industry. I recently went to visit a college over in Morningside where people are learning how to manufacture, it was young blokes, a few women there, and they were learning how to make wind turbines. And they were saying there the problem they're having is holding on to them to the end of their course because they're so skilled that all these companies just want to snap them up before they're even finished. So there are plenty of jobs there. I think we need to redefine defence entirely. We should be talking about human security. The challenges we face in the coming years are going to be about food, they're going to be about water, they're going to be about oil, and they're going to be about energy. And all these things are totally interconnected. If it got to the stage where there wasn't enough water, we probably wouldn't be, we wouldn't be discussing whether or not we're going to blow ourselves up. We'd be discussing how on earth we're going to come to an equitable, sustainable solution to make sure everyone has got access to clean water. In fact, clearly at the moment in the world, people don't even have access to clear water, and here we are, spending obscene amounts of money on weapons that hopefully will never ever be used. It is complete insanity. So I agree with you entirely. I think let's redefine defence and let's stop fighting illegal wars because someone else far away has suggested that we do so. Thank you.
I've worked for nearly 30 years in the Arab world. The last 13 and a half before I retired was working out the Arab British Chamber of Commerce, mainly with the Gulf region. And a long time ago, 20, 25 years ago, those of us who dealt with the Arab world realised there was a great resurgence of Islam taking place. I noticed it personally when a friend of mine, middle-class family from Cairo, Abir was her name, and Abir had been born in London, educated in Cairo, she was Egyptian, and Abir always came in with her hair absolutely lovely when she was in London. Until one summer, she came in with a headscarf on. And I said to her husband, Zaki, did you make her do that? No, he said. Middle-class women in Egypt are now starting to obey the Quran, putting the headscarf on because the burqa had to do with the Quran and things like that. And so we picked up fairly early that there was a resurgence of Islam. It's only about, the Islamic calendar is only about 1485. It's the Middle Ages. This is actually a relatively young religion. And no one who knew the Arab world thought it was anything other than suicidal to do what we did in Iraq. And then go on into Afghanistan. So, one thing I don't think any independent Scottish government's got to do is participate in that kind of lunacy once again. But we have to think very differently. Have you ever thought of what we can do with the second aircraft carrier? I mean, I said, look, it's a division of assets and liability. You take one, okay, you've got the aircraft to put on it, but that's your business. You take that one, we'll take the second one. Now, what could you do with the second one? You could create a Scottish humanitarian emergency group and fill that aircraft carrier with the kind of supplies and skilled personnel that people need in the areas where they're struck by earthquakes and tsunamis and other natural disasters. And you could go and ask the Indonesian government or the Singapore government if you can get berthing abilities there, if they would take you on. That would be a significant contribution by Scotland with something that's usually used to destroy people on this occasion, actually to serve people's basic interests who are under enormous strain and damage. So we've got to think differently. Nobody's going to attack us. I mean, there's no question to south of the border. Who is going to attack us? The answer's nobody. But the Scots wouldn't accept you don't have a defence force with the oil industry and with the fisheries protection. But think outside the box and think what we can do with that second aircraft carrier.
floor and you can ask whatever questions you want. So, Sean first.
I'm very encouraged by the attendance here because the question really is, there's a big number of undecideds out there. So what does the Yes campaign to do about that? And remind people that, of course, it's after the referendum that negotiations will take place, and there'll be almost certainly a new government elected. But what I'd like to do is to just quote, if I may, from the Scotsman, where a headline yesterday was that the Yes campaign chief only arranges seating plans, claims die. But the message later on, you see, was rather the reverse. And of course this is a tactic of the media. If you superficially look through the headlines, you know, it's against the Yes campaign and etc. And then I read from the Scotsman, there'll be an election to choose a government, and it will be for the political parties to say their policies and priorities in an independent Scotland. Our policies and priorities is to give people in Scotland the opportunity to make their own decisions. That could easily be a Labour government that's elected, or a coalition of Labour, etc. And I've been in the Labour movement all my life, actually. Now I'm in the Green Party. But anyway, the point is that it's tremendously important, especially I've met the mixture in the Labour Party, for independence, for against, or just not bothering because to hell with politics and so on. But it goes on. In the interview, Mr. Darling claimed, quote, Mr. Salmon plans for a currency union with sterling, which would lead to political, which would lead to a political union. And then it goes on. Previously, Alistair Darling said that currency union was not independent. And he used the word servitude. Servitude. Well, he's telling us that's what we've got now. That we shouldn't, that independence won't change. And then,
Can I just make one last point?
the last point. Well, actually, instead of going, what I want to really emphasise is the need to get through to undecided. And for example, I've not received any information except from the web, which is important. But the No campaign web is even better. Shows the happiness and anyway, I won't go into that. The point is, I live in the Buxton estate. There are 800 holes. I could leaflet it, but where are the leaflets that will get to the undecided?
Okay. So the question is two parts. How do you change the minds of the undecided? How do you counteract negative media and where are the leaflets for you? Yeah. What is the first point?
I was still sucking my soother. One thing you said right at the very beginning, Ray, which I think is a really welcome remark, what amplified, that this is Ray Newton for the Greens. I know Ray is a tremendous regard for him. And Ray can vouch for the fact that in the last few weeks, the Edinburgh People's Festival held a debate on independence. There's more than 100 people turned up. 2 weeks ago, Alison, Ray, other people here were at a Scottish Socialist Party public meeting, what we call the commie pool, for obvious reasons. And there was 76 people turned up. There's another 70 people here tonight on a Friday night. And I think what I'd draw people's attention to, these are terrific turnouts for meetings on independence. I think there's an appetite, there's an interest. This is an issue that's sweeping the country. And I think these gatherings of this size begin to illustrate there's something very, very, very important happening. And I can say, I'm sure Jim and Alice and Lucy will back me up. I've been to quite a few public meetings where nobody came. So we have here a phenomenon in front of us, and I think it's important, and I think it's right and fitting that we stop and consider what is happening and we're part of it. It reminds me, I've been around the block, it reminds me of the early days of the anti-poll tax campaigns where people began to engage in it. I'm not sure where I stand, I'm not sure what to do if the sheriff officers come to do, I'm not sure if there's anybody else feels the same way as I do. And I think that's very, very important, it's very, very important. I'm a great believer in social media, Twitter, Facebook, emails, I've got a blog, I've got a website. I should let you into a secret. Other friends of mine, party members, operate them for me because I haven't got a clue how to work. But I support them and I agree with them, right? However, I'm also wise enough to know people say, oh, the Arab Spring was led by people on Twitter and Facebook. And I think to myself, Egypt, personal computers, 80 million people. No, that wasn't led by social media. I'm sure it helped, but it was led by meetings like this, people getting engaged in issues. So that's the first thing that's well worthy of saying. To cut to the chase and raise question essentially is, how do we win the referendum in 2014, isn't it? To me, the answer to that question is we have to offer people some of what we've been offered and we've discussed tonight, which is a vision of changing the world. We're in the process of changing our world. This is what's happening. I know it sounds like hyperbole at meetings like this, but it's 300 years since Scotland had a parliament. It's 300 years since we were a nation, we determined our own decisions. And we're about to be given the chance to rectify a wrong. It's a profoundly important debate that I make no apologies for, reminding people and putting it in that context. So I'm passionately focused. How do we win the debate? I have to say, the critical ingredient for us in the Yes campaign is to show our fellow Scots this is about change, my friends. This is an agenda for change. It's not more of the same. We're not just keeping things as they are. We're not about to unravel the Union flag for the top of the city chambers and put up the saltire and that's all there is to it. No, this is about building council houses for those in need. This is about giving people operations at the Royal Infirmary that they're currently denied. This is about putting shoes on the feet of Waynes in Edinburgh that don't have them. This is about changing the world in which we live in, and it's a powerful, powerful ingredient. It's a powerful, powerful process because it's you and me that's going to do it. And we look at this. Last year, you looked at the Arab world that Jim talks so eloquently, knows so much about. Tunisia, Egypt, Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, you went through them all, and there was a contagion here that people are saying, we're not putting up with this any longer. And I've looked at the development of Muslim fundamentalism, and it's arrived, it's developed, because it's a choice in that part of the world, either between a US-backed, brutal dictator who's never even heard of the word democracy on the one hand, and these mass organisations like the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. And that's why people are sweeping to that direction. And I think that's an important phenomenon we've got to deal with. And the key to it for me is, as a socialist, I'm grappling with all the time, how do I as a socialist persuade working class people in this country that they're going to be better off under independence? Economically, socially, culturally, politically, democratically. That's my job, that's what I'm engaged in for the next 2 years. And I have to say, I've been hugely encouraged. I have to say, with respect to I look at the Yes Scotland campaign, and I stand here and others involved in it, and I look at Better Together, and I think we have the momentum, we had the launch, we've had a rally. Can you imagine Better Together having a rally of 15,000 in Princess Street Gardens on a Saturday afternoon? You get Labour activists who are twittering that they're refusing to be seen near Tories in Scotland, if they can find any. So for me, I think the momentum is all on our side. I'm not complacent. It's good that the polls are against us because it dangles the carrot always. No complacency. We've got to get that missing million people who don't vote in any election usually. We've got to engage them and they've got to vote on our side in 2014.
To win over the majority, we'd better be realistic. Tonight's meeting is a very good one. But if you analyse it, it also shows the weakness in the Yes campaign. You've had Colin's opinion on what he would do if he was in charge of policy, Alison what she would do if she was in charge of policy, But realistically, they ain't going to be in charge of policy in an independent Scotland. No, I'm not insulting anybody. We've got to face it. If you're in the Yes campaign seriously, we better face the reality. And the reality is there's an SNP government that's going to set the question, which has the vast majority of the members of the Scottish Parliament and is a dominant force in Scotland at the present time. And people are likely to judge independence upon what the SNP say. Now that may be uncomfortable, and it's not because I'm in the SNP, I'm way out the fringes of it. That may be uncomfortable for other folk in other parties or no party. But that is the reality we are going to face. Alex Salmond is a dominant figure inside Scottish politics. And it might be, folk might not like it, but that's the reality. And what happens tonight? There is no SNP policy that I, as a member of the party, can actually talk to you on. Tonight, you got my ideas, not the SNP ideas. There's a vacuum there. And that vacuum, in policy terms, is being filled by the other side. You can't get in, you can't pay this, and all the rest of it. With the strategies quite clear on the other side. Is to keep us at 32, 33% in the polls until we get to the back end of 2013. And then try and see if you can win the referendum. That's what they're really saying. And if we've to win the referendum, we'll have to be 60% in the polls when it comes to the real campaign. Now, I've been through referendums. I went through the 79 referendum, and I saw what the fear factor can do to people. So from 60% we'll be dragged downwards. If we're not at 60%, we're in danger of losing the referendum. So a great deal of responsibility rests upon the shoulders of Alex Salmond, the SNP members of the government, the SNP members of the Holyrood Parliament, and the party as a whole. And they've already made one mistake, and that is to say that we'll be in a currency alignment with south of the border. Now, if you're going to have an agreement for a joint currency, you need a treaty between two separate countries. Because there's no point in being a currency union if you haven't got seats on the central bank. So you need a treaty for that purpose. Do you think for a moment that during the campaign, George Osborne's going to come up here and say, "No problem, we will welcome, we've already drafted the treaty"? He's going to say, "Well, there'll be no treaty." So we're left with a problem about the currency. So the quicker folk all over the Yes campaign, but particularly inside the SNP, start to question a policy like that, then the better we're going to be later on, because that policy will have to change. Darling's right. You cannot have an independent economic and financial policy if you're in a currency union, especially if you're 5 million and the rest is 60 million. That's the reality. So those members of the SNP in the audience tonight should go back to the branches and start to talk to their MSPs and start to talk about reversing some of these policies so that when we go into the campaign, we actually have a coherent policy that will stand up to criticism.
Thanks for that question, Ray. I'm sure Ray's aware that Greens aren't actually formally part of the Yes campaign as yet. It's something that's on our agenda to debate at conference next weekend. So I'm sure if you read the news, you'll see what that decision was. We're a very democratic party. We just thought it was important that the whole membership be involved in that decision. But we certainly do support independence. I think what we all have to do, actually, as your other half, Margot, suggested the other week, is just get out there and talk to the people we know. Hey, I'm normal and I support independence. You know, a lot of people can't believe I'm green, actually. You know, people have perceptions of what people who think a certain way look like and how they act. You know, they might think that if you support independence, then you'll be walking up and down Morningside High Street waving your flag with a saltire on your cheek. I think you just need to show people that you're normal and that you think this is really important. You think it's high time we were entitled to take responsibility for ourselves and to make our own mistakes. I think it's very, very difficult to counteract negative media, but I do think it can be done. I don't get the impression that sort of national established media loves the SNP, and I think it's fair to say certainly didn't do you any harm in the last election. There is a lot you can do. If we look at Edinburgh, there are 3 council wards in this city, well, 2 council wards that the Greens win outright. There's one actually here, where we're second. Now, national media don't help us to do that. Nobody really helps us to do that. We get out, we knock on doors, we attend events, we meet people, we speak to them, and they say, oh, those are quite interesting ideas, or I quite like the way you're going about that. So there's a lot you can do yourselves. We don't have to rely on constantly positive coverage, but I'm sure if people see that we stay calm, that we're focused, that we have a coherent message, we're not all going to agree on everything, because different parties have different visions, and so we should. But I think it's vision that is going to win the day. And I personally, for me, the politics of fear, I just find it totally and utterly distasteful. I shared a platform the other night with a Labour MSP and a Conservative MSP, and they both had the good grace to say, we believe that Scotland can manage on its own. That's not why we believe that we shouldn't become independent. So I think there's realisation out there that we can do this. The facts and figures suggest that absolutely we can. And I just think we have to have a bold vision. Barry's question first tonight was, should the Yes campaign focus on equality and what society might look like? I think there are a great deal of unanswered questions. Ray's question was about how do you convince, we've got the yeses, we've got the noes, and we've got this group in the middle who are just simply undecided. I don't think at the moment they're hearing enough information, they're not getting the sort of story, there's not the narrative there that's compelling them to make up their minds, and that has to happen. And I think, I think Better Together are probably going to constantly stay. It's going to be a negative message, it's going to be a message of fear, but I think we should be saying, look at the opportunities. Are things so fantastic at the moment that we think we couldn't do better? And nor is it's not realistic to say, actually, as soon as we become independent, everything's going to be absolutely wonderful. But I think it is about being able to decide upon our own destiny. And even as I said earlier, yes, the ability to make our own mistakes and learn from them.